This is CTS, family-friendly television. We care who's watching.
Hi and welcome to Rhonda London Live. On the show today, getting tough on organized crime. That's what the Ontario government aims to do with Bill 155, a controversial piece of legislation. The idea is to take the profit out of organized crime by hitting criminals where it hurts the most, in their pocketbooks. The proposed law would make it much easier for the government to seize the profits of criminal syndicates without charges even being laid. That has civil liberty organizations incensed. They claim the proposed law is unconstitutional and that legislation that aims to circumvent the proper process of law has to be judged, in the end, to be a bad law. What do you think? Does Bill 155 frighten you? Do you think it gives police and the government too much power? As always, the phones will be open to take your calls to hear what you have to say. Don't go away. We're back right after this. The Ontario government wants to get tough on organized crime by hitting criminals right in the pocketbook. The government wants to make it easier, much easier, to seize the profits of organized crime without charges even being laid. With his thoughts on this, we're joined by Detective Sargeant Rick Wills of the Hamilton Police Service. He has some 14 years of experience in investigative work, including drugs, outlaw biker gangs, and major fraud. Rick, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
As a police officer, give your perspective on this story. It must be frustrating when you're trying to investigate organized crime, particularly when you see criminals profiting.
That's for sure. You always have to look at the end result. These organized criminals are in the business generally to accumulate assets. And one of the ways that we found over the years to attack these organized criminals is to take away those assets, take away the toys, take away the motivation to commit the crimes.
Well, Canada already has seizure laws. Just how difficult is it to utilize those, the existing legislation to seize the profits of illegal crime?
Yes, of course, Canada has laws in place now, and they've been in place since I believe 1989, and of course we have used those laws. It is fairly involved to make that type of seizure, but we do accommodate that, and I think that we look on the new legislation as providing us some more tools in our toolbox to accommodate the end result. And then, of course, when we look at this new law and people say that that gives too much power to the government, I think that the police, as an enforcement group, will look at the law and exercise due diligence when we are doing these investigations.
It's astounding to me, though, that the Ontario government is proposing allowing the seizure of property without charges even being laid.
Well, once again, I think that when we enter into an investigation, we'll look long and hard at the subjects of that investigation, and we will have gathered certain evidence and information that will lead us to believe that they are an organized criminal group, and that basically they have no other means of accumulating these assets. And I look at it from another angle too, and when I look at it from the street level, which I see every day, and I look at the communities and how they're affected by the profits that these organized criminals, especially in the drug trade, are making, and see the frustration of the communities involved, that they can't stop it. They need help, and this may be one way to assist.
Well, one of the things that frightens me as a citizen is the fact that even with the full due process of law, mistakes are still made, sometimes serious mistakes. Look at David Milgaard, for example, or Guy Paul Morin.
Right.
I mean, these were serious mistakes made when there was the full due process of law. So what happens if you lower that standard?
Well,
because it's a fairly serious punishment, I would
Sure.
think, if you take somebody's house or their car or their boat or their business.
But once again, as I say, I think that we will be diligent in investigating these matters, and we will exercise a great deal of discretion. But once again, you know, you can't, I don't believe, compare an unlawful imprisonment with taking a piece of property from someone. And I think that society as a whole will look at that, and at the end of the day, will, you know, people have to open their eyes. And I've been in the business long enough to hear a lot of people make a lot of excuses when they become involved with organized criminals and saying, well, my gosh, I didn't realize that this is what they were up to. Well, maybe it's time for people to open their eyes a little bit and exercise some due diligence on their part when they're dealing with these people, and when the police show up at their door to seize their car or a piece of property, then you know, maybe it shouldn't be such a surprise.
What's wrong, though, from a police perspective, with Canada's existing seizure laws?
Well, there's nothing wrong with them, and as I say, we have used the proceeds sections of the criminal code many times, and we, as a rule, seize assets from drug dealers and other organized criminals involved in enterprise crime. And as I say, I think this will and of course, it's in its infancy. I compare it to back in 1989 or 1990 when the federal legislation came in. There was a learning process, and I don't really believe that we, once again, that we as the police will go that far on the limb to do something that's going to put both ourselves in jeopardy and the community. So it's growing.
If there's nothing wrong with Canada's existing seizure laws, which have a much higher standard of proof, you have to have due process, what's the point then of lowering that standard?
Well, once again, I believe that it's going to give us another avenue to attack the organized criminal, and you have to appreciate the building process and the difficulty in investigating this sort of thing. It is very intricate, and it is also very costly on the behalf of the police and the judiciary to investigate this sort of thing. And if we can use, as I say, use another tool to affect an end, then that's what I think that's what we'll end up doing.
Do you feel sometimes when you're fighting organized crime in Canada with limited police budgets and whatnot, that it's almost like a David and Goliath situation with the police service being the David?
Yes, it has been, and I think that's why we're seeing now that police services are launching into partnerships with other police services. And as it stands right now, a lot of the money that is seized goes back into a fund and accommodates that sort of partnership so that we can attack. But it is frustrating because with reduced budgets, it is frustrating for us to come up with the adequate resources to attack organized crime, because they have the resources. A lot of times we'll find that they have more sophisticated, more expensive tools in their toolbox than we have in ours, and it is frustrating.
So just how tough is it to build these cases?
Well, as things stand right now, you have to show a continuing enterprise usually, or that there's the assets have been gained from a crime, and in drug dealing in particular, you have to be able to prove that the proceeds came as a result of drug dealing or of an enterprise crime, and it is tough to build the case because once again these organized criminals have very good legal support. They have very good research facilities they know exactly where they can go with things, and they know a lot of them know the best way to launder their money to try to avoid detection by the police, and sometimes we can only get to the tip of the iceberg on some of these people.
So do you think Bill 155, if it indeed is implemented, will make your job easier?
Yes, I do, but I don't see it as something that's immediate. I see it as something that we have to work our way through and blend it in with the federal legislation. And once again, I still believe that we will exercise that due diligence, because police are, enforcement is becoming more accountable now. We have, and you mentioned people being unlawfully imprisoned, Moran, and a lot of legislation.
Well, the reason that I brought up that point is because this has been a miscarriage of justice when there has been full due process.
Yes, and I fully understand your point, but I bring out another aspect of that, is that these situations were all examined very carefully, and a lot of guidelines came out, and a lot of training came out of it for the police. And as a result of that, investigators now are more aware of liability, more aware of accountability, and I strongly believe that that as a result of that, police officers and investigators are more aware and more accountable now than they were before.
Rick Wills, I know that you have to run, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the show. It's been a pleasure talking to you again.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. Phones are open right now. I want to hear your thoughts on this. The number to call, 905-332-3131. We're back with more right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about Bill 155. It's a controversial piece of legislation from the Ontario government. The idea is to crack down on organized crime, hitting criminals where it sometimes hurts the most, right in the pocketbook. The government wants to make it a lot easier to seize the profits of crime without even criminal charges being laid. Joining our conversation, criminal lawyer Dean Paquette of the firm Lamont Paquette. He's also the past president of the Hamilton Criminal Lawyers Association. Dean, thanks so much for joining us. Your thoughts on Bill 155? It's not yet law.
I think it's dangerous. I think it's politically motivated. I think it's sold as an act to deal with organized crime, but is not limited to organized crime. I don't think there's much that can be said against the idea of attempting to seize the proceeds of crime and the profits of crime from people who are benefiting from it. But right now we have a regime in place under the Criminal Code of Canada that permits the police to do exactly what they want to do now with far greater protections to citizens, and ensures that those people who are charged are treated fairly and properly, and only those people who are committing serious criminal offenses are likely to have their property seized from them. And then there's a way by which they can defend themselves.
Well, clearly most people, most law-abiding citizens, if you ask them, do you want the government to crack down on organized crime, they would say the answer is a definitive yes. But do ordinary citizens, should they be frightened about this legislation?
Well, I think they should. It's not limited to organized crime. The only place organized crime appears in the Act is in the title. And the Act is so broadly drafted, it catches within its context anybody who, where two or more people agree to commit some unlawful act, and some unlawful act could be against the criminal code, any provincial statute, a law of a foreign country, where there are perception that it might cause injury to the public, which could be inconvenience to people or result in expenditures by a government body or public body or municipality to investigate them. So, although it's sold as a bill directed at organized crime, it's not crafted in a fashion that focuses energies on organized crime. It focuses on virtually anybody who commits any criminal offense or any municipal offense or a violation of any provincial statute.
Well, the principle, the presumption of innocence is an important tenet to the criminal code, and it's something that we hold dear. But under Bill 155, there's no presumption of innocence. As a matter of fact, the accused has to prove that they didn't actually benefit.
Well, it's not that they have to prove, but the burden is far lower. It's on the balance of probabilities. If it's alleged that you committed an unlawful act and these are proceeds from that unlawful act, if you happen to be an innocent owner of property or have an interest in that property, then you have to establish that you didn't have something to do with it. Those individuals bear that burden, which is extremely high. More importantly, I believe the government of Ontario doesn't have the jurisdiction to enact this legislation. It's legislation that's primarily directed towards criminal law. There's already provisions in place that have a far higher standard that is enacted by the government that has the authority to do so, which is the federal government. The province, in my view, is venturing into areas where they don't have jurisdiction. They'll be challenged in the courts as unconstitutional.
Well, you say that this is clearly unconstitutional. Why do you say that? Because
the whole act is designed to deprive people of their property for the commission of unlawful acts under the Parliament of Canada or the province. This is an area of criminal law. In fact, it's so clearly a matter of criminal law that the Parliament of Canada has enacted provisions that do much the same thing, and they've been in place since 1989. They are restricted to people essentially committing serious criminal offenses or members of criminal organizations. It has a definition. And remarkably, the police need new tools. Well, they've got lots of tools in their toolbox. They've had them since 1989, and quite frankly, they're not used very often.
Do you think this is a real slippery slope? Are we becoming a police state, particularly if Bill 155 becomes law?
Well, I get very nervous when the police say, trust me, we won't abuse the power that's given us. I think that is a slippery slope. If we abandon, as citizens, control over the judicial process and criminal process and allow the police to be counted on to exercise good judgment, because sure, police officers are perhaps more accountable than they used to be. They're better educated, better trained, but nevertheless, when they become involved in an investigation, sometimes objectivity is lost. And when there are profit centers to be seen in taking people's property and putting it in the consolidated revenue fund for purposes of the benefit of the province or municipal police departments, there's a danger that they could see it as a way of augmenting their budget.
Do you think the government is going in the wrong direction? Not so much in getting tough on organized crime and trying to hit these criminals in the pocketbook, where sometimes it can do the most damage, but instead of perhaps putting more resources or more money into police services, maybe better police work, building these cases more carefully, instead the government is lowering the standard.
I agree. When you examine most budgets in government, the one that seems to be able to withstand reduction is the police budget. All other departments seem to be hit by budget reductions, but the police budgets always seem to be increasing by 2 or 3%, argued that, well, we need more police officers on the street. And police departments have to make a choice as to how they allocate manpower. They community-based policing, or they have strike forces designed to investigate serious criminal activity. And there are choices to be made and decisions that will reflect your value system. We've seen recently the arrest of a great many Hells Angels in Quebec and Ontario, and that was as a result of a long police investigation. We'll see in due course what comes of that investigation, but clearly if they're prepared to devote the manpower to conduct appropriate criminal investigations, they can establish that people are in possession of the proceeds of crime and go after it pursuant to the provisions of the criminal code that already exist. They just have to make those choices. They don't need new tools. They just have to allocate the resources to the tools that they have.
What do you think if Bill 155 becomes law in Ontario, looking maybe down the road 5 years or so? Do you think innocent people are going to have their property seized?
Well, I think the first thing that will happen, there will be a test case that will challenge its constitutionality. If it survives that, and there will be a period of time when everything will be in limbo until such time as the case is dealt with in the Supreme Court of Canada, and assuming it's found to be constitutional, then there will be lots of abuses. People will have their property seized. In the United States, there are similar provisions for forfeiture, and often the police department gains directly the proceeds of that which they seize, whether it's airplanes or boats or automobiles or money. They see that there is an incentive, a direct incentive, to go out and enforce the law to their own benefit, and that invites corruption. In this particular case, the funds go into a consolidated revenue fund, which is really the government bank account, to be distributed as they see fit, with certain recognition within the statute as to who might be entitled to it. But it may be seen for the government as a profit center. And when there's a profit center, there becomes motivation to act, and motivation to act could result in abuse.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about that, but first we have to take our commercial break. A couple phone lines open. Want to hear your thoughts on this subject as well today. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today the question we're asking, does Bill 155 go too far? Want to hear your thoughts on that. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're joined in studio by criminal lawyer Dean Paquette. I want to go right to phone calls, bring as many callers in as possible. So let's go to Marcel on line 1. Go ahead, Marcel, you're on the air.
Hi.
Hi, Marcel. Oh, I guess we've lost Marcel. We're having a little bit of time. Hi, go ahead, Marcel.
Okay. I've experienced similar laws in the United States. Like, I've seen programs about it, yes. And it seems to me that they're drafted so vaguely that they're subject to abuse. Like in the States, for instance, they found that a lot of counties would trump up a charge against somebody because of the fact that they owned, say, a valuable piece of property that had potential for commercial use or something like that. And it's just to go in there and be allowed to charge people without having any evidence is just another Big Brother situation, in my opinion.
Marcel, thank you so much for your phone call. And while police can't charge people without any evidence under Bill 155, what they can do is seize property without charges ever being laid.
Or laid and people acquitted.
So the government seizes your property, all charges, you're acquitted of all charges, and you don't get your stuff back?
Well, what they do is they go to a judge and they can seize your property on an ex parte application, which means only the police lawyer is there, and the judge says, okay, you seize the property based on reasonable grounds of belief. They tie up your property so you can't alienate it, you can't move it, you can't do anything with it, and then they tell you that they've done this after the fact, and then you may be charged in addition with a criminal offense. You get acquitted of it, and they still say, too bad, we're still going to take your property from you because we're going to establish on the balance of probabilities that this is a property that you shouldn't possess. Now, at least under the criminal code, you have the protection of there being a conviction registered. And once there's a conviction registered, then the test is still in the balance of probabilities, but it follows a conviction. Here, there's not necessarily a conviction, although there is one, it's presumptively that you committed the offense for purpose of their civil action. But there's none of the protections that are afforded in the criminal code. And as I say, you could be found not guilty, and they still are intent on seizing your property. And in addition, the Act overrides a lot of the freedom of information legislation that's provincially existent and municipality existent, and they're obliged to disclose it to the Attorney General for purpose of such proceedings, who in turn can turn it over to the police if he sees fit to do so.
So how low is the standard then?
Well, the balance of
how low is the burden of proof before the government can step in and seize, Freudian slip, seize your property, your houses, your cars, your bank accounts?
Well, it's the balance of probabilities, which means if
more
only
likely
slightly
than
more
not.
likely than not, 50.0001%, and it also engages you in a civil dispute, which carries with it certain provisions of discovery, which I would think would exist, although it's not clear from the legislation, that you could be obliged to implicate yourself in discovery aspect of this. Whereas if a criminal charge, at least you have the right to remain silent. And these are issues that I think fundamentally affect how we perceive the administration of justice, and why I think these are issues that are best left to the federal government, not to the provincial government. Next thing you know, a city might want to do exactly the same thing. Well, we'd like to take your property too if you're committing an unlawful act, because we think this would add to our tax base. Of course, they don't have the authority to do so, in my position, no more so than the province.
So just how ripe is Bill 155 for abuse?
I think it's ready to take off. The government, I think, motivated because speaking out against organized crime or against crime itself is a vote getter. No one is against that in theory. What's dangerous and why people who are law-abiding citizens should care, it has such a broad net. It catches within its scope people who've done relatively minor offenses under the provincial legislation, or haven't committed a serious criminal offense, or maybe really minor bit players. Example, cars can be seized, or planes, or boats, when they really had nothing to do with the crime, except that it happened to be a vehicle in which something was transported. Maybe mom and dad's car, and their son may be off at a rock concert with a buddy, and he's taking a little bit of marijuana with him, and before you know it, your car's being seized, and you have to establish you didn't know he was using the car for that purpose, and that if you'd known about it, you would have reported him to the authorities. It has the potential to be draconian, and if it has the potential to be draconian, there will be circumstances when it is misused and abused.
Well, Marcel mentioned the United States, which had, I guess the pendulum swings back and forth, had gone really remarkably far forward in terms of seizure laws, and now in many states seems to be drawing back, realizing that there was an abuse of power.
I think where there is a conviction, and I don't think the public should walk away from this thinking that the power to seize ill-gotten gains of crime doesn't exist. It does. If people are found in possession of stolen property, it gets seized and forfeited. If they can establish that it's the proceeds of a crime, they can forfeit it. They can initiate proceedings under essentially organized crime provisions under the criminal code and forfeit the profits. If someone dies before they can be prosecuted or absconds facing prosecution, their property can be attached. It just requires that you go through a certain procedure, which procedure affords protections. Those protections don't exist in this legislation.
Dean Paquette, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. Phone lines open right now. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Today we're talking about Bill 155, a piece of legislation the Freedom Party of Ontario strongly opposes. Among its objections, the fact that Bill 155 would essentially allow a person to be punished, have their property seized, without ever having committed an offense. To tell us about that, we're joined by Robert Metz. He's the president of the Freedom Party of Ontario. Robert, thank you so much for joining us. I'm great. You said when you were reading Bill 155 that you were just actually shocked and appalled at what you're seeing.
This is one of the most scary pieces of legislation that I've seen cross my path in a long time. You know, it's been asked, or you've been asking, you know, what are the odds of this bill leading to abuse? I think the bill itself is an act of abuse because it takes away everything that we've earned since basically the Magna Carta as citizens of a free, supposedly free society. The thing that separates a free society from a totalitarian one is that we have these due processes in place, that we have the right to defend ourselves in a court of law against any accusation, that we have the right, you know, and a process in place by which to follow, and that if we are acquitted, then the responsibility falls on the other party to make good. This law ignores all of those principles and in fact goes so far as to say that you don't even have to commit an act, but you can be guilty of some sort of unlawful activity, which is really funny, activity, if you do nothing, like they call it an omission. So maybe you could be guilty of unlawful activity for failing to return, turn in your tax return in time, or anything like that. Of course, the big thing is, it's purportedly aimed at organized crime, who I think is going to benefit tremendously from this bill.
How so?
Well, first of all, if we're talking about organized crime, we're talking people with a lot of money, a lot of power, and all the resources that the police say they have, well, they will just simply move their assets out of the country or out of the province, and therefore the police will be left to get those more vulnerable people who do not have lawyers to go and protect themselves in courts. In fact, that's who the targets have traditionally been in countries where they've done this. I was doing some investigating. If you want to see some horror stories, by the way, about what's going on in the States, there's a website called fear.org, and it stands for Forfeiture Endangers American Rights. Well, it endangers Canadian rights and European rights and anybody's rights who uses these laws. For example, in Detroit, and this happened in 1988, it was just adjudicated in 1996. To give you an idea of how long these cases will go on. But in Detroit, for example, police seized an automobile because they caught a man inside it soliciting a prostitute on the street, which was an unlawful activity.
Right.
So they seize the car. They find out later the car belongs to the man's wife. She wants to get the car back. Now, that happened in 1988. In 1996, they finally decided that no, she can't get the car back, even though she knew nothing about it, probably wouldn't have approved of her husband's activities.
Indeed.
But he used the car and probably didn't tell her about it, and yet they get to keep the car over something like that. And there isn't even any punishment aimed at the perpetrator of the crime. This is strictly asset forfeiture. They don't really do anything with the criminal. In fact, if anything, they're going to want him to keep making more profits so that they can steal them. It seems to me that here you have the police saying that organized crime is profit motivated and that's an evil thing, but hey, now we're profit motivated too, but that's good. I don't think so.
Is that one of the things that troubles you, is that the people that are responsible for seizing the property in the first place could ultimately benefit?
Well, they do benefit, whether, if not directly. In the States, they benefit directly. We've been told that they've gotten around that problem by making sure that the money is used for other purposes, including victim compensation, which is a little ludicrous in this kind of an issue when you're talking mostly drug laws and laws of that nature, where prostitution and the vices, basically, where we don't traditionally regard a victim as the same. As Belleville lawyer Karen Selleck mentioned at the hearings, she can't really see people who are, quote, victims of drug laws, say, somebody buying a bad mix of drugs or didn't get the marijuana he thought he was going to get. He's not going to come to the government for compensation. I mean, the whole thing is a voluntary area of activity, which is again creates a bigger problem and gives the police way too undue powers.
Well, property rights are not enshrined in the Constitution. Could that be problematic?
Well, it is. It certainly is one less protection that we have against the people who enforce the law. There's even a broader picture here in that the laws we're talking about, I really don't think even should be against the law. If you really want to take the profit out of crime, if that was really the aim, you know what I would do? Legalize drugs tomorrow. Legalize the vices, control them, regulate them, make sure they're kept out of certain areas. Like you should never have prostitution in the streets. That's not an issue of organized crime or otherwise. And also you have to ask yourself, what does the average citizen expect from his police and from his police forces? And I think if you talk to the average person, they're not thinking organized crime. About 50% of people have tried the drugs that organized crime supposedly is selling. But most people want to be sure that they're safe in their homes at night, that when they go to work in the daytime, their house isn't going to be burglarized, that they can walk the streets safely. And yet those are the areas where the police constantly tell us they can't do anything for us. Well, if that's what you're telling me, as far as I'm concerned, you're useless. And then if somebody else wants to take over their job, or like in London we have a problem now because there are some private groups like the Guardian Angels that want to come out and guard the streets. Well, the police are all up in arms. Well, then why aren't they out there doing it?
Well,
that's what I want to see. I don't care about the rest of this organized crime stuff.
You bring up such an excellent point, and it's something that we're talking about earlier in the show. If you do want to go after organized crime, would it be, would the problem be better served by putting more police officers on the streets and building better cases using the existing forfeiture laws?
Well, we have existing forfeiture laws, but remember that you have to prove that someone was guilty and they have to be convicted of a charge, of a criminal act.
The government is saying that's problematic.
Right. Well, it is, and therefore it should remain so. That's what keeps us free citizens, because in every country that they've used these things, they just start abusing them. And in fact, at the Bill 155 hearings on February 20th, Police Chief Fantino made it very clear that the police intended to use the full scope of their resources, whatever is given to them. So he's basically saying up front, yes, you give us this power, we're going to use it. And to me, that's already an abuse of power, because such power should not exist in a free society.
Isn't that what the law is supposed to be, to govern that? Instead of, does it trouble you, the fact that the police services are saying, you know, well, yeah, this is a lot of power, but we're going to use discretion, and you don't worry, trust us?
Well, I personally don't trust the police. I'm already involved in 2 or 3 cases in London where I know for sure the police have misled the public and not told them the truth about certain cases, and gone after people without the proper evidence and the proper, you know, no due process at all. Just amazing things that are going on in London. I've been in the courtroom twice watching people get dragged in over not criminal charges, but having their assets taken under forfeiture laws. It's already happening in other areas, and crimes are not necessary to be committed.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about that, but we have to take a commercial break. Also, our phones are ringing. I promise when we come back, we'll get to some of your phone calls. The number to call, 416-203-0302. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. The question we're asking today, the controversial piece of legislation, Bill 155, does it go too far? Let's go to Sasha on line 5. Go ahead, Sasha. You're on the air.
I didn't see the whole program. Yes. I'm very much afraid about Bill 155.
Why is that, Sasha?
I'm afraid it's going far too far.
Okay, how so, Sasha?
I think one has to be very, very sure before make any decision with such a drastic consequences. And we see what happened in the criminal justice system. And civil and criminal justice system are 2 branches of the same tree. We see how far Milgard went through, and this is just one of them. And what is a due process? Are you going to compensate somebody after somebody went through 10 years through the process? I'm a victim of assault. It took about 3.5 years my case to get to court. I filed claim through Criminal Injuries Compensation Board. The Criminal Compensation Board make 2 decisions. In one, they determine I was in a wheelchair when I wasn't. In another one, a crime was not committed in spite of the fact that I paid myself on transcript of trial, and I brought a court documents. With a system like that, we have to be very, very careful.
Indeed, Sasha, you bring up some excellent points. And the reason that I brought up the David Milgard case or Guy Paul Moran is the fact that these were 2 people who were accused of very serious crimes, murder, enjoyed all of the full due process.
Yes, and that was in a process where we're operating under the principle of, you know, beyond a reasonable doubt, determining guilt, and we still are making mistakes there.
Still mistakes are made. But the balance of probabilities, I don't think people fully understand what that means. It means that something is more likely than not. And that could be, as Dean Paquette suggested, you know, 51% more likely than not.
Yes, and it could just be some thought in somebody's mind. I mean, this process I'm familiar with because I defended a lawyer before a Human Rights Commission. And the same kind of civil process is being used there. In fact, I started realizing halfway through that this is what's happening to our criminal system, is that we're starting to take the principles that we run some of these civil bodies on and putting them into the courts where they don't belong. They don't even belong in half of the civil bodies. But it suddenly dawned on me that the issue was no longer guilt or innocence. It was just a matter of satisfying someone's complaint when you're going through a Human Rights Commission hearing. Now, in this kind of a situation, it's a little bit different, but I even wonder if the whole issue, you know, you hear people saying about Bill 155 that it's reverse onus. Well, I think it's far worse than that, because even if you prove yourself innocent, they're still saying they can take your property. So you could be charged and acquitted, which means that you went through a process, they examined the evidence, and they found that you were not guilty. And yet they're still going to take your property. So reverse onus is irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether you can defend yourself or not, and that's exactly how it works essentially in the Human Rights Commission if you happen to be the respondent.
In terms of protecting civil liberties and personal rights, though, how important is that presumption of innocence?
Absolutely important. It's what our whole society is based on. You know, we take for granted sometimes our freedom, and we think that, well, we see crime occurring here and there, and we think, oh, we've got to do something about it. Well, I would much prefer to have our crime rate than to have a police state. And the issue is every free country or a non-free country has a certain crime rate, and you always have criminals, and you have the appropriate laws to deal with them. This issue goes far beyond any, doing anything about crime. In fact, the bill itself does nothing about crime per se. It just makes sure that police get to share in the profits of crime. And to me, if that's a profit motivation to keep organized crime going, I've never seen a better one. But then I've always believed there's sort of a symbiosis between the police and organized crime just by virtue of the fact that we have drug laws. I mean, that benefits both. Organized crime doesn't have to pay taxes on the money it makes. It doesn't have to be accountable to anybody. Once you're on that black market, it's almost like what we would all like to be on, kind of, but it shouldn't be illegal. It would be a free market. I think it's worse paying taxes all your life than paying the occasional fines that organized crime people have to pay.
You bring up a provocative point.
They always say a tax is a fine for doing good, whereas a fine is a tax for doing bad.
That's a good point. Robert Metz, our time is gone.
Oh, wow.
But I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's always such a pleasure having you on the show.
Terrific.
Don't go away. We'll be back with news from our medical files right after these messages. Stay tuned. From our medical files today, in the U.S., a number of drugs have been in short supply. The flu vaccine, 2 drugs used to induce labor, another used to treat cardiac arrest, and tetanus vaccines. Now patients undergoing surgery may not be getting the top-line preferred drugs when they're being put to sleep. Anesthesiologists say supplies of some key drugs have disappeared without warning, raising concerns about patient safety. CNN's Rhonda London has the story.
Northside Hospital in Atlanta, one of the busiest community hospitals in the country, performing 30,000 surgeries and delivering 16,000 babies a year, forced to ration the top narcotic used for surgical anesthesia. Why? Because supplies of the frontline drug fentanyl dried up without warning.
I was shocked by that. We immediately began what I call internal rationing. We took all of our fentanyl out of surgery and reserved it for our obstetrical anesthesia population.
That's because fentanyl is the superior drug choice for epidurals, used during childbirth and after surgery for pain control.
At least 4 months we've been rationing it, and which required us for narcotics to go to what I consider second choice drugs.
So all general surgery patients, from knee surgery to heart bypass, end up getting second choice older narcotics such as morphine, from which patients take much longer to recover. As a result, recovery rooms at Northside are almost always full, creating surgical logjams. For patients, there's a greater risk of respiratory distress because older drugs are much tougher to dose accurately, and doctors and nurses have little recent experience using them.
I think it has reduced the margin of safety.
Experts say the anesthesia drug shortage is being felt across the country. The Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota is also feeling the squeeze.
We have seen a shortage of multiple drugs that are of relevance to the practice of anesthesia: narcotics, muscle relaxants, and a variety of other supplemental drugs.
Of particular note, a key muscle relaxant, succinylcholine. It's used in emergency cases to put patients to sleep very quickly. Substitute drugs are slower acting, increasing the risk of lung problems and possibly even death. To preserve its precious supply, Mayo pharmacists have resorted to repackaging the drug to its lowest possible safe dose. Doctors at both the Mayo Clinic and Northside Hospital say the shortages have not caused serious patient harm yet.
What happens in places that aren't as well staffed and well equipped as Northside and other urban hospitals are, it's a cause for great concern.
A survey of 344 hospital pharmacists by the Institute for Safe Medication Practices shows nationally there have been some close calls. There have been at least 6 overdose cases when using substitute drugs. 3 required CPR. The pharmacists also report episodes of phlebitis, hypotension, itching, hallucinations, nausea, and substantial increases in patient recovery times. In addition, the pharmacy group reports dosing errors when a replacement drug sufentanil replaced fentanyl, causing one patient to develop respiratory arrest. Another patient became unresponsive, requiring emergency treatment. Why are some anesthesia drugs in short supply?
In some cases, financial decisions have been made about whether it is profitable to supply a drug or not. In other instances, there have been issues of quality control.
Drug companies give other explanations. Abbott Laboratories say it has been unable to meet demand for fentanyl and succinylcholine after competitors stopped making similar or competing drugs.
It seems to be. It seems that the drug companies make choices of what they want to do and sort of when they want to do it based on maybe what works well for them instead of what works well for the patient.
Pharma, the trade group representing large pharmaceutical companies, says decisions on drug production are made by individual companies based on marketing plans or availability of raw materials. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration says it cannot order drug makers to produce drugs. The agency can evaluate a reported drug shortage and determine its effect on public health, but it has no regulatory responsibility or authority. Unless a company is the sole producer of a drug, it doesn't even have to tell the FDA it plans to halt production. So if there's no drug, it's the patient who may have to pay the price.
I think the solution is informed patients. Yes, we've been taking care of it. Yes, we're providing safe care to you. But would solving this problem make it easier to do that and safer for you? Yes, it would.
For patients undergoing surgery, it's reasonable, doctors say, to ask, do you have the drugs you need to take care of me?
That's our show for today. Thanks for watching. I'll be back here again tomorrow starting at 2. Hope you'll join me. In the meantime, have a great afternoon. I'll see you again tomorrow.
You're watching